Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Kyle here again, Managing Director of Capacity Building International, and welcome back to another webinar in our 2021 webinar series of International Models in Emergency Management. Now, today is going to be about the medical intelligence. Sorry, I was having some feedback there for a second. But today's going to be medical intelligence, which is a little bit of a shift from what we're normally talking about. But I think this is going to be extremely interesting. So thanks for joining us today. A couple of different changes that are coming up. So first of all, I've turned on live captions, which are down below. It should be in the bar for the Zoom settings. That's now available for anybody that wants to use those. That was a request from one of our previous webinars. We've now enabled it. It is automatic. So you get what you get, right? It's going to be automatic, and so you can take a look and see how that works for you. All right, so just a few quick points, of course, as always, as we do the administrative remarks before we start the actual webinar itself. Let us know where you're joining us from in the chat and use the Q&A feature. If you do have any questions or anything else like that, just use that Q&A feature because it does a couple of things. It lets the panelists know that you have a question and we can see it. It doesn't get lost in the chat as things go by. And second of all, after we end the event, we can run a report on the questions and then we can follow up with our speakers in case there's any questions that we missed. So far in 2021, and we're actually getting close to closing out the year. So we've had 21 of 24 events so far. We've had 1,640 attendees from 72 different nations now. So that is where we are really reaching out to a global audience. And it's, thank you everybody for participating in that. Now, if you want to follow our event and you haven't done so already, we do have a LinkedIn event. It's been running the entire year, which is a little bit strange for LinkedIn, but we've been sort of using the system that way. Go ahead and head over to LinkedIn and you can find the event. It's hosted by Capacity Building International, but you'll find it there, and it's in cooperation with TEAMS, the International Emergency Management Society. And join the LinkedIn event because there's 300, almost 400 different professionals from the emergency management community there. And then you can follow that. And that's where we also post links to the previous webinars, Q&As or questions that we've answered from previous webinars as well. You can find more information there and inside that event. Now, next, I wanted to make a sort of special announcement that the TEAMS annual conference is now open for registration. The conference itself is from December 6th to 10th. And it's going to be throughout the entire week. And you will be able to go to the website. I will post that in the chat here shortly. And you can go directly and register there. The conference is free. It is open for registration. And you will be able to find the entire program online. There's a small sample down there on the bottom of the screen, which shows all the guest speakers. I think we have about 55 different speakers during the week in different presentations. So certainly it's going to be worth attending the event. I attended last year. It was very informative and really a deep dive into a lot of different subjects. I highly encourage everybody to attend that is available during that week. Tune in and then watch the presentations when you can. It is really exceptional. And with that, I will turn it over to Harold to see if he has any opening remarks and comments about the conference. Harold, over to you.
Yeah, hello everybody. Hello Kyle, hello James, who is on it today. I actually look forward for this because the medical part of the emergency is really important. Sometimes we forget it. We had an attack in Oslo, if everybody knows, back in 2011 by a terrorist. The one thing that really worked well was the medicals. They did their work, whatever. Police and everybody else was really stunned what happened, while the medical emergency, they knew what to do. So I really look forward for that. Concerning the conference, actually, I would like to add that we have 21 nations. The authors are from 21 nations. So it's actually a very international event. So please register and be part of that. That was my opening remark, and I look very forward to the presentation today.
All right, thanks, Harold. Okay, now next, we'll introduce our guest today, Jim Wilson, Health and Security Intelligence Expert and CEO and founder of Med2 Medical Intelligence. Now, I had seen Jim on LinkedIn, where I generally run across most people these days, but posting a lot of things about the pandemic response, which were really interesting. So I reached out to Jim to see if he would give us some additional information, insights to the work he's doing over at Med2 Medical Intelligence, and to share his thoughts about how things are going these days. And Jim, welcome. I really look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be able to share our perspective with everyone. This is a real treat and a pleasant surprise for us. I'm a pediatrician by training, so that's kind of like you can think of it as a day job, right? But for the last 25 years, my specialty has been to watch the world for health security crises. And health security crises are defined classically by a pathogen for which we do not have diagnostics. We've not described it before in science, and it's capable of generating tremendous, rapid, acute, and sort of a surprise attack of socioeconomic disruption. And so when you think of what I just described, that is a really narrow subset of what public health does, actually, right? Is because these things, they don't occur very often. It's sort of your 100-year flood kind of scenario. And that, of course, then presents the classic crisis that all emergency managers sort of dread, is that surprise hit with something that we don't have a lot of experience with. And so COVID has just completely demonstrated that 16 ways to Sunday, that classic pattern, right? And so in a way, I've basically spent the last 25 years preparing for exactly what we're about to present to you today. One of the analogies I've used for folks when they're trying to understand how we fit into the ecosystem of preparedness response and public health versus not, military, civilian, intelligence versus not, is really we're kind of like a specialty service, right? So in clinical medicine in the old days, it was comprised of general practitioners and surgeons, not a whole lot of specialization. And really, we were not much better than just providing nursing care. And a lot of times we hurt the patients, at the turn of the century. So it wasn't a very well-developed field. But now fast forward to the present, and we have specialists in all different specialties, and we cannot really practice medicine without the concerted effort of everyone, all of the specialties, right, working together in tandem. And that's another major theme and message with the COVID response. And so what I'm going to present to you all is snippets from our after action report that will be published shortly in the journal Intelligence and National Security. It has passed some of the bulk of the peer review, but we had to make some edits to the report, which were well received. But so stay tuned on that, and I'll certainly share that with Kyle, and he can pass that on to you all once it's published. But what we're going to do is we're going to share with you the proceedings, basically, of a Chatham House Rule workshop that we held with all the participants. The unique side of what we did is we basically embedded a health security warning intelligence specialty group represented by myself with an emergency manager who is in charge of managing the operations for an entire statewide hospital system. So here in the state of Nevada, using this as a test case for this action, you're looking at a population of roughly 3 million people, the bulk of which are clustered down the south around Las Vegas. Okay, so this is the state that hosts Las Vegas. Okay, and this was also an example of a public-private partnership. Okay, so here's the historical context, which is really, really important, I think. Our team, we have been doing this for 25 years. We did provide warning on swine flu in 2009. We also have been involved in providing warning and detection for events like Ebola and Nipah, various rounds of MERS as well. We were on deck for H5N1 when it first emerged in Asia in the mid-2000s and spread into Europe. We've been involved in the detection of a couple rounds of vaccine-drifted seasonal type A, H3N2 influenza. So these are basically, you can think of them as non-routine health security crises. They're not the full pure health security crisis, of course, that COVID represented, but we're testing ourselves, right? So we're learning on these kinds of events every time we engage and try to detect and then provide warning communication. The historical case studies we have published in several peer-reviewed academic journals, our treatment of historical examples of extreme events in the health security world. So the 1889, 1918, 1957, 68 influenza pandemics. And what we've done is we've gone back and looked at local media reporting at the countries that experienced these events for the first time, to understand how do human beings actually communicate these types of events, because it's very different than just your standard public health surveillance approach, where you're documenting, robustly case counts of a disease that you actually understand very well and you have diagnostic tests for. So, for example, the reporting of cholera. We've been doing that for decades, right? And we understand how to do that. We understand how to use that data to good effect, with policy, right, to prevent the exposure of the public. We've also been involved in looking at historical examples of alleged acts of biological warfare and terrorism, so we understand what those indicator patterns look like as well, and how people communicate those kinds of events, as well as laboratory accidents. We were on the ground in Haiti, for example. We were involved in sort of unpacking how did cholera get to Haiti. That's a conversation for another time. But so we're very familiar with this question, or this nexus of concern about how do these events get there in the first place. The secret is, a lot of times we really don't know until after the fact, which kind of highlights the importance of embedding someone like me with an emergency management person, because we have to respond no matter what's going on. We can't care if it's a lab accident. We need to move to intercept the issue very quickly at times. And you'll see that play out here in my presentation. So, warning failure. We have a robust history of warning failure. So don't let anybody fool you. This has been going on for over 100 years now, is that we're not very good at detecting particularly respiratory disease events involving a new pathogen. Okay, so whether you're talking the 1889 pandemic or the 2009 pandemic, there's always a delay in there. And when you unpack the process of warning failure and why did we fail to provide warning in a timely fashion, it's the classic stuff that you all have seen with other types of crises, where we weren't focused on the problem, we didn't have enough funding, we didn't have enough analysts, we didn't have a linguist who speaks that language. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. And I think here in COVID, we've often focused on blaming our political leadership, but these trends have been going on and transcend political leadership and administrations for decades, right? So we, as you all know, we do a very poor job at investing in preparedness. Okay, it doesn't matter what the crisis is. SARS, MERS, these are other examples, right? So I think we have this belief that we detect things quickly, but again, oftentimes we find when we go and do the after action reports, which unfortunately typically are not publicly available, we find out, hey, this signal was on the ground and available publicly on the internet for months, and we're not rolling up on it, and we're not getting ahead of these things. And I think the complacency that led us up to the current COVID issue is kind of revealed in these examples, is that a lot of these crises we've seen so far, it was sort of a torpedo across the bow. Like they didn't become the manifest apocalypse that the media had proclaimed with each of these crises. Okay. And I can talk about Zika, I can talk about Ebola in West Africa. And from, of course, from the perspective of those of us who were involved in the response for some of these events, we would say, well, geez, it didn't turn into a mess because we did intervene, right? Well, that's part of the story. The other part is, we don't really actually technically do a very good job of risk assessment in this domain either. Not everything is equivalent to 1918 level impact, okay? All right, so here's an example of a historical case study we did on 1918. We are the only team in the world that we're aware of that went back in and actually went through every local media report in Philadelphia, for instance, and analyzed it for the indicator pattern, to see how did the evolving human communications look like as the days went by, when they realized, oh my gosh, what just happened? Our hospital just abruptly filled up with patients who are trying to die on us, right? That kind of a pattern. And what we've noticed over the years is when we go back and look at all these historical examples, and now we have a whole library of them, the pattern is very similar. The pattern is the same. And we've often referred to it as the exigent sequence. So it's kind of like the DNA of social disruption, the DNA of human communication related to these events is remarkably similar across time, across culture, across language. It is for us the Rosetta Stone for realizing something's just happened. And we typically are not able to accurately predict when that something's going to happen. So I think that's another huge threat of miscommunication, out there in the world is that we actually can't predict these events very well. We know generically that these are risk events that could happen, but we typically are caught by surprise when they happen, okay? Leading into this, so this is kind of a great segue. So we knew going into this whole thing that we had a mess of strategic issues, okay? We had a lack of investment in public health preparedness. So that's your foundational infrastructure, right? So this is kind of us assessing the vulnerabilities of our community and our nation from our perspective. We already knew that this was going to be a mess if this were to ever happen in our lifetimes. We also noticed that because public health was kind of getting desperate for funding, there was a lot of, squishiness with how they were calling other crises, right? So leading into this, it seemed as though every season of influenza was the worst we'd ever seen in 40 years, right? Every health security crisis is pandemic potential. There was no seeming, it's kind of like the analogy that I would give folks is the hurricane categorization scales, right? We didn't have that kind of a process going on in this. It was everything is worst case scenario every time. And what we noticed in the background is we had this pretty big surge of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine resistance and anti-vaccination sentiment spreading on social media at the same time. And so we kept trying to caution our leadership, hey, you got to back off on this. We get it. We need to vaccinate. We get it. We need to invest. We get it. We need to scare people into investing in this infrastructure. I get it. That's one tactic, but it's going to backfire on us eventually. And sure enough, it did with COVID. Right. So we saw this coming. We saw a lot of these issues that you see in the media playing out and social media playing out. We saw this building because, again, it's that delicate balance of trust. If we can't talk intelligently about this kind of thing, then you're not going to have the public alongside with you when it comes time to actually respond. And that played out in spades all over the world. Now, let's unpack kind of what we did. What were our actions here? So because of our experience leading up to this, we know what these signals look like, right? And so very quickly, we saw that media report coming out of Wuhan, and it was in English. So we already knew it was probably late. The report was late by at least a couple of weeks, and that's pretty classic for these kinds of events. And what we noticed was the initial reporting seemed like a surge of severe illness, but we didn't have report of healthcare worker infections. And we didn't see, some of the other concerning indicators that we would typically see with these events. And so that could have been due to deliberate withholding of information by China, certainly. I mean, we're very experienced monitoring China, so it's kind of like it goes with the territory. On the other hand, we noticed the timing of these reports actually was pretty quick. With SARS, the world wasn't talking about things until months into the event. And this time we're talking about the event probably about 2-4 weeks into this, right? And so there was a pretty big time collapse going on here in detection. And so that was kind of interesting. And we tried to issue a lot of positive reinforcement messaging, publicly to say, hey, good job, China. You did a good job here. Right. So I recognize that goes in conflict with some of the narratives around the CCP and possibilities of a lab accident. But for us, we want information. Right. And so accusing people right out of the gate, that's not going to get you the information you need. You got to be very professional, and you got to be very giving. Right. Very positive, and encouraging people to work together as a team and across borders. So on December 31st, we did issue public notification by way of our LinkedIn account that we were tracking this with priority. Now, this is the crux. On any given day across 50 languages and 180 territories in the planet, right, or 200, depending on how you count them, right, poll to poll, you got about 5,000 to 6,000 live active threads of communication about outbreaks and epidemics, okay, of all kinds of diseases, right? And so here is us demonstrating our specialty is we know the one thread of report that you've got to pay attention to for the planet, right? Like if you're not going to pay attention to any other report of outbreak, this is the one you got to kind of be aware of, right? Kind of thing. And we know darn well that they won't necessarily pan out to a full-scale pandemic or a full-scale disaster, right? So that's kind of the thing, is that having professionals really understand, what you're looking at and where it could play out, but also all the caveats, right? Because we do get false alarms, just like tracking hurricanes. Sometimes they look like they're going to evolve into a big hurricane and they'll just fizzle out. Same thing is true with these threads of reports. We also noted it publicly that our country was connected to this city by direct nonstop air traffic to the tune of about 5,500 passengers a month. So this was no joke. And that made us nervous because of our experience with swine flu. We knew that by the time we detected it, there was a reasonable chance that the pathogen had already been picked up in the air traffic grid and may already be inside our own country, right? So there's a whole lot of, angst in our team when we see these things, because we know about the uncertainties, okay? The other thing that we're doing here with this action is the ethical obligation of warning intelligence in this domain. We do not withhold information if we're talking about a global crisis, okay? And then, so we did take the action to directly notify WHO's Global Outbreak Alert Response Network. They know who I am. And I went in there and I had not spoken to them since swine flu. And so I said, we are tracking this. We are engaged, just FYI. Okay. We also told them that the signal pattern did not match that of SARS 2002, 2003. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But we basically were hypothesizing this was something new. And that was validated later. I believe it was on January 5th when the Chinese published the entire genome of the virus. So that was a successful assessment. So January 5th, this is when I engaged the emergency manager, right, for our hospital infrastructure. And this is where the magic began, okay? This is where your community of emergency management was just wonderful. Like this is where the fireworks began, okay? Is that this wonderful relationship where we were tied into a group of people who knew what to do with the information, right? There was lots of uncertainty, of course, right? But they really were able to have a very cogent discussion of what do we do next? Here's what we know, here's what we don't know. This could fizzle out. We don't want to overreact. We don't want to underreact. All the classic problems, right? With emergency management. So it was a very good conversation on January 5th. This was the data as it was reported by China over time. And this is probably what Kyle was seeing on our LinkedIn account, is that we were tracking this live. When you track this kind of information live, there's no accuracy here. We always know that. And so the media made a big deal out of this, but it's like, well, welcome to the party. This is the way these things are reported, always, is that there's all this uncertainty. They're doing the best they can without a diagnostic test, I might add. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we call a patient COVID positive, right? And so, we tried to give the Chinese grace and just say, look, if we were in the same boat that they were in, I don't think we would have done a whole lot better, in terms of clinical recognition, right? So there was all this confusion about just how lethal was this virus, as you may recall. And a lot of our job at the time was to point out the other side of the discussion, which is, why wasn't Beijing completely inundated with this virus? Why wasn't, Shanghai completely inundated with this virus? By a certain point in this, we would have expected to see other megalopolitan areas, the provinces, with tens of millions of people packed in there, at a high population density. We should have seen this virus really go, if indeed it was spreading at the level of 1918, as the media and social media were proclaiming. Looking back on this, we did say publicly that we did not assess this to be on an equivalent scale as 1918. We also actually said that we're not seeing this on the scale of even 1957 yet. And that was based on the per capita fatality rates that we were seeing out of Wuhan. And we did not agree that the Chinese were able to get containment that effectively if this virus was that transmissible. I don't think anybody would have gotten containment if it was, for example, the Delta wave doing this, okay? So we'll come back to this concept later, but this is that awful conundrum of how do you balance your warning communications and maintain trust, particularly in today's world, okay? So as I mentioned, we're watching China. Well, we might not completely trust China for all kinds of reasons, right? And not the least of which is, well, maybe their infrastructure doesn't function the same way as ours. And so what we were trying to do is figure out, can we look at another country whose infrastructure medically was similar or at least approximate to ours? And so there was a check and verification process going on at this point in the timeline. So now we're talking January into February, and we were watching Hong Kong and Singapore. We knew it was going to get there eventually. Hong Kong, Singapore, both those areas of the world have had a lot of experience dealing with high threat, infectious agents, respiratory agents, right? Like H5N1, like MERS, like SARS, right? And so it was a real important litmus test for us to check and see, how did these countries do with this, okay? And what happened was, and you can see this with the gray box there, if you were to zoom in on that, it looks like a big wave, right? So context is everything. At the time, it looked as though Hong Kong, even though they had a healthcare workers strike going on, were able to seemingly manage this crisis. Same thing with Singapore, very low ICU admission rates. It's kind of seemed a little bit ho-hum. And so we started feeling a little optimistic. We're like, okay, we might have a chance here of this turning into more of a crisis and not a full-scale disaster. We had our fingers crossed, right? So a little bit of optimism started showing up here in our assessments. And again, we were not assessing this to be on the level of 1957 or even 1968 pandemic. And a lot of this was coming from this early data. And this is how we were communicating with our hospitals. So now, then something happened. Okay, so if you rewind the tape, you'll also remember, for those of you in Europe, that if we go back a step here, this gray box also corresponds to the time period of Bavaria. So you may recall that Bavaria had an outbreak amongst their factory workers, and it was pretty ho-hum. The only people who were hospitalized for observation. And so Bavaria was not inundated with a 1918 epidemic, right? And it seemed pretty ho-hum. And so again, we're saying, okay, we're not saying it's not a crisis, but let's not overreact here. This has got our full attention here, but let's not panic, okay? So what's at stake right now at this point in the timeline is our supply chain, okay? Our supply chain is heavily rooted in China. We don't need to panic and get everybody onto Amazon buying up N95 masks this early in the response, okay? So that was a huge issue that we were worried about, right? Is overcalling this and triggering a panic buy, which was another one of those indicators that we were very familiar with and expecting to see with this kind of crisis, because we've seen it before in every other pandemic we've studied, okay? The other thing that we knew was an issue was the anxiety provoked among our healthcare providers. If we don't have a test to test these patients, and we think that we don't have adequate PPE in place, are our critical care healthcare providers going to show up for work in the ICUs? That was a huge question. We were very concerned about that. And social media, by this point, was just completely run amok. Everybody's talking about 1918. In fact, I had a lot of peer pressure on LinkedIn to get with the group and start calling this 1918, right? And I refused to do it. I said, this is not what we're assessing right now. We'll see, right? Certainly the potential, but we don't, the anxiety was unproductive. So now, Lombardia. So the key flip point for us was when we watched what happened in Lombardia. And at the time, I will tell you, we didn't really know. We either thought that our assessments were dead wrong and the crowd was right after all, right? Or the virus had mutated. At the time, we had no access to genomic information. We just don't have that competency on our team, I guess. The data wasn't available. We didn't know what was driving the issue. All we know is that Italy, we just basically sat back and said, holy cow, what just happened? Like, we went from ho-hum in Singapore, ho-hum in Hong Kong, ho-hum in Bavaria, and now Italy completely and totally lost control and just got abruptly overwhelmed. And you see the flat part of that yellow line on the graph in the lower left-hand corner, that's them capping out, right? That's them going to battlefield triage. We ran out of hospital beds, healthcare workers infected, dying themselves. This is the worst case scenario. This is actually what, what we were worried about, is this kind of an effect on our critical infrastructure. Okay, so all of my bias here is assessing whether or not anyone's hospital infrastructure can keep up with this thing until public health has time to catch up and give us good guidance on what to do. Okay, what we found out in August. Okay, so we're talking about late February, early March, and we noticed what was happening in Lombardia, Italy. We didn't find out till August with a peer-reviewed publication in Cell, the journal Cell, by a genomics team that pointed out this was the stabilization of that spike protein, that mutation that enabled this virus now to be transmitting so much more efficiently. So it was a mutation. Okay, that's our going belief right now as to what happened here. And we did pick up on that signal change in Lombardia, and we did communicate that to our hospitals. And you'll see that play out in a minute here. So here are this is straight from that paper, just copy pasted from the paper. The reference is there in the lower right-hand corner. It was like a light switch had been thrown. So what we were tracking was that Wuhan wild type strain, which looked okay, manageable, right? But then Europe, for whatever reason, they got unlucky, and the virus mutated when it got to Europe. And then it simultaneously hit New York City, and things went very quickly from there. Okay. So the warning sequence for us, how do we convey the risk communications back to Nevada, really is, just to review here is, okay, we're seeing impact in a foreign country. Is it spreading to other proximal sites? Is it spreading by air traffic now? Is this site comparable to our infrastructure, our location? So we're trying to understand, will we see the same impact that Wuhan saw? If so, that's pretty darn scary, right? Calling up the military, quarantining entire cities. I mean, there's no way we can do that in our country, right? So, we just, we had to sort of check and balance a lot of what we're looking at here and see if it's comparable, right? And really ask ourselves, okay, are we connected to this site, and how so? Well, we were through Las Vegas indirectly. We were certainly through San Francisco, that port of entry. And then therefore we were then now watching California very closely, right? Because the port of entry was right there to Wuhan. Okay, first contact. Sounds like Star Trek. Here we go. So this is a timeline of sort of what happened, just to kind of cut to the chase. In the early days, right? And I forgive me, it says 1st of May. That's not the 1st of May. It's January 5th, and I don't know why it flipped around. I can't get it to unflip in the slide there. But we had initially, we brought this issue to everyone's attention. We had initially assessed that this is low risk to our infrastructure based on our level of air traffic connectivity, cultural diaspora, okay, and the status of where this virus is in terms of its potential to take down our infrastructure, right? We emphasize that the key point, the key intervention at this point is check a travel history in the emergency department. Do not allow an unrecognized patient with a positive travel history make it all the way up into the intensive care unit unrecognized. That came from the lesson learned with Toronto and SARS. If you allow that one patient to get into your facility unrecognized and unaccounted for, from an infection control standpoint, you potentially have lost control of a major metropolitan hospital just like that. Okay, and I say that because now you've got it transmitting inside the hospital, out of control potentially, infecting your critical care staff, of which you don't have a whole lot of surge, right? You don't have a whole lot of extra critical care physicians lying around, right? If you take out the head of your critical care unit with an unknown pathogen that we don't have a diagnostic test for, you're done, right? That hospital is a mess, okay? And now you got to clean up that mess, right? In addition to all the public communication stuff you have to do. So we knew what the risks were here, okay? We also knew that, remember what I told you all before, is that our hospitals had formed the opinion that CDC had overcalled all the other health security crises leading up to this. Okay, so we're still dancing that fine line of I want you to prepare. You better take this seriously. Do not blow this off. Yes, I acknowledge that we have tended to overcall things in the past, but this could really get ugly if you don't pay attention. I mean, so it was this constant back and forth, you know, trying to get people to engage, okay? And it did work, it did work. Now, from January 29th to the 3rd of March, we did escalate our warning from low to moderate risk, and that was based on demonstration of international spread and impact to infrastructures comparable to ours. At the same time, we had a substantial uptick of social media-based misinformation and escalation of hype, just unproductive, not helpful hype, right? Because we're about to go to war here. I don't need people trying to freak us out, okay? That's not helping, right? And I'm sure you all have seen that with other crises. I mean, so we were very much in that mindset. Then we noticed what happened in Lombardy on the 25th of February. Then we escalated, and the escalation was human-to-human phone calls, personal face-to-face meetings. You know, this is when things escalated very quickly, and we basically said, we better build a hospital surveillance system right now. We actually were not funded to do that. We had to get emergency funds piped over to us so that we basically stood up our state's first hospital surveillance system online in 10 days. We had every single hospital in our state reporting about 50 data elements every 24 hours voluntarily without legal requirement to do so. It was a massive coming together of volunteerism. It was wonderful. It was such a success, you know. And it was because of that escalation point that we documented with Lombardia. That's really where everybody kind of said, all right, that's it, we're doing this. Now, here's another view of it, another visual of the same graph, right? So just colorization, right? So it's just like hurricane alerting, right? Where it starts off as a tropical depression, then it goes to a Cat 1 or 2, then escalates to a Cat 4, now it's a Cat 5, you know, everybody run for cover, right? Same deal here, you know, as we were dialing up the messaging to our hospitals, okay? Now, when we activated the hospital surveillance system, keep in mind that like most folks in the world, we did not have access to accurate diagnostic testing. We weren't even really protecting ourselves. Yours truly was actively seeing patients as well. I got infected in the first wave, okay? I mean, I got lucky, I was healthy. No vaccine, of course, right? So we had no countermeasures effectively. We just kind of went into the first wave. So that all of our effort leading up to this was to prepare us for that awful first wave. The first wave is the period of highest risk for these types of crises because of lack of familiarity, right? So when you're talking to a community that's never seen this before, this is where we felt like, you know, our greatest risk of failure and loss of control was really in that first wave, okay? So once we got the system up and running, and we knew what the data elements should be because we watched what happened in all the other countries, plus we had all the historical case examples. So we came in loaded for bear. We knew exactly what needed to go in that surveillance system. You got to track your bed counts, you have to track your ventilators, you got to track your oxygen capacity, et cetera, right? Well, once we turn on the system, and you can see it in the graph there in the bottom, we realized we were already in the middle of the first contact wave. and, you know, this is where the element of luck comes in, is that we happened to see the Wuhan wild type strain. We did not get hit with that mutated strain that showed up on the East Coast. So here's where the element of luck came in. And as you can see here, is that we did get hit, but it was actually quite manageable. And in fact, we didn't really even notice that we had been, you know, that it was actually affecting our hospital infrastructure until we turned on the system. So it's not like people were coming in and really complaining at this point. It was just like, oh, okay, look at that, you know. So a lot of luck in here. So I don't want to portray a feeling of, oh, we knew exactly what we were doing at every step of the way. No, we're dealing with the classic problems that all emergency managers had, and that is uncertainty and balancing public trust. So here's where we are today. This is the capacity of our entire ICU infrastructure across all of our metropolitan areas. You will see that it's not even close to 100%. This is the result, in our minds, of effective management. Okay, we did the best we could with the mess we had. We're not saying we're perfect. We're not saying we're even the best state in the United States, but it's poignant to note we did not lose control of our ICUs, not a single one. And we did not require federal DMAT support, which was that emergency call-in of federal assistance, okay, of medical professionals, okay? So we were able to manage our way through this crisis as bad. I mean, it did get bad and a lot of people died, right? But we were able to strike that good balance of, okay, this is going to be a mess. We're not going to get 100% vaccination of our population. Even if we did, the vaccine isn't perfect either. We know that, right? I mean, so we did the best we could with what we had, and we're actually quite proud of this. Can we quantify the difference that access to early warning intelligence made? Can we quantify that? We cannot. Okay, there's no ethical way to do it, because we weren't going to warn one city and restrict information to another city to run an academic study. Okay, we're not going to do that in the middle of these things. Okay, it was just the impression of the workshop participants, the folks who had access to this information. They felt like it did make a difference, especially in those early days for the first wave. Once we got past the first wave and into the summer wave and into the B117 wave that appeared in the winter, by that point, now everybody kind of understands, okay, this is what we got to do. And now the infrastructure has adapted to the crisis, right? And we're getting used to it. And we're building forecast libraries. We're anticipating when we're about to hit 100% capacity in the ICUs. We better make some staffing changes. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble, that kind of thing. And it's become now a matter of routine. And that is that nice, beautiful transition that we wanted to see happen. Healthcare worker illness. This was a big deal in the beginning, as I mentioned. There's that big spike there on the left. Okay, so this is exactly what I was talking about. And unfortunately for us, this was the part of the operation that our academic colleagues just would not listen to us. They would not just tone it down on their comments to the media, on their comments on Twitter, social media. It was unproductive. And we actually just simply got lucky. Okay, so we had a lot of folks who did not want to show up for work because of anxiety, but also a lot of folks were asked not to show up for work because of contact tracing. So there's a lot going into that spike there. But the concern is real, particularly with the first wave of contact with an unrecognized or poorly described pathogen. The anxiety component is real. And I think we as a global community probably did a poor job managing that especially in that first wave. So here is the warning, sort of the cascade of I would say preparedness posture maybe, or response operational posture of our team, if you will. And it's based on just an assessment of how are we doing with this issue. Is this routine normal operating conditions? Are we dealing with a routine crisis like just a bad year of flu? Are we dealing with a non-routine risk event that's coming from a foreign country but it's not quite here yet? Are we dealing with it's here, but it's not causing a lot of damage, right? So we've actually migrated up and down this scale through these waves, okay? We've never hit the level 1 there, which is a disaster. We kind of came close to a 3 to 2 there at one point with the B117, but that was managed, right? Through the use of effective risk communication using our forecast libraries. So conclusions. Well, we think from now on, we need to embed a health security warning intelligence analyst with emergency response, with emergency management, right? We need you guys. Because if we're off over here generating warnings and we're not connected to you, this is not going to work, right? So this to me is the new paradigm, and I'm completely biased. I'm a private industry guy, okay? So of course I'm going to be biased, but after our experience with our state, we do believe that this is a new specialty. We might be able to train folks in this specialty, so they understand how to do this work from their end. It might not require a full-time analyst, of course, because these crises are rare. But there's no question that we created a little bit of magic here, and it's all about the people and trusted relationships that emergency management knows very well, the value of trust. And trust is hard to surge in the middle of a crisis, right? So here's just a screenshot of our portal. that tracks the data from the hospitals. Now everyone has dashboards, monitoring COVID, right? So, but this dashboard now has sort of become our emergency, tactical emergency management hub. You'll see that we now have an emergency communication module in here where hospitals are reporting in and saying, "Hey, I've run out of staff. I need somebody to send a few nurses over here," kind of thing. And so we've learned a lot from this crisis and used the crisis to innovate. You'll see on the right-hand side of that graph here, that was a live shot as of this morning. We are seeing resurgence. We think that's because we need to roll out our booster shots. So the Israelis saw the same thing. You'll see a little bit of a rising in hospitalizations, and that just means you got to deploy that third shot to mitigate that. And then let's see here. This is the integration. This is ongoing of warning intelligence with our hospital surveillance system. So risk reports is what we call it. But basically, this is how our team now communicates. We just use the portal. We just file our reports in there. And now it's just become a matter of routine to see that, oh, wow, the health security intelligence team is tracking a new subvariant that's reported out of UK. And it's not sensationalized. This is just operational input, to our hospitals. So it's just become a matter of routine now. We also do, you'll see down there in the bottom left-hand corner, we also do antibiotic resistance forecasting. And so the topics that we're addressing now are moving beyond COVID. So what we're now doing is we're transitioning this system into a non-COVID setting so that this persists. So one of the main threats to what we've done here is just the classic panic investment cycle, right? Where, okay, now first sign of COVID being over, all the funding disappears, everything collapses, and once again, our team dies like a phoenix, which is what happened after swine flu, right? So this is classic for us too. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I think I hit 40 minutes right on the dot.
Oh, that's great, Jim. Thanks a lot. So we've got one question, and I've got a lot of questions actually, but we'll start with one from the audience and then go with that. But the question is, how do we best manage the expectations of transparency with the impact of social media distortion? Does it make sense to use ICS methods of one voice pushing data that we can refer to? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, okay, so I'm not an emergency manager.
Sure.
And truth be known, I'm not involved in the ICS process. So that's going to make probably everybody recoil in horror. The fact that I just said that, I'm counting on my emergency management colleague to do that, right? But in terms of social media, I do think that we've entered into a dangerous part of our human history where anybody can say anything and it can spread like a wildfire all over social media, right? And you've seen that. Your neighbor down the street, if they have a loud voice, they can spew all kinds of misinformation, I will say that the disaster sociology academic community had published a lot on this topic of who do people pay attention to? Who do people trust, the general public? And I think it's worthwhile to go back and review that history. And Dennis Milletti was kind of the godfather of sort of herding all of that information together in a nice review. And I can certainly share a copy of one of those wonderful reviews with you, Kyle. But it basically just speaks to, there's nothing we can do to control this tendency of the public to go listen to grandma before they listen to the authorities kind of thing. On the other hand, what we struggled with is it seemed like everyone is in charge, no one's in charge. And there's actually a case fatality rate associated with that behavior. People are going to die if you don't get your communications in order, right? And so then this raises all kinds of civil liberty questions. If you shut down social media in the middle of one of these crises, everybody's going to, are you going to lose more trust if you do that, right? And I think people have been struggling with that question, at least so far as I know, since the 1950s at least. When they worried about nuclear holocaust, right, is how do we get information out to the public in a helpful way? I defer to actually you all in some of that. I can tell you that from our perspective, our objective was to serve as as a non-emotional, apoliticized voice on social media that just said, look, this is what we're tracking. We are concerned. We're not playing politics. We don't care who's in the White House. I don't care who's in charge. We are going to notify our hospitals because we learned that lesson from swine flu. We're not waiting for the bureaucracies. I don't care what country you're in. We got to protect that critical infrastructure before we run out of time to do so. So that's kind of the controversial aspect of what we do, is sometimes we will step over and move to intercept the issue if we're seeing hesitation in the bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, what the pandemic has highlighted is sort of the speed of communications and not being able to control that. So having to be sort of that, lighthouse in a storm that has factual information, that is consistent, that is reliable, in your opinion, and things like that. But I think the other thing that goes along with that, Jim, is the fact that there's greater public scrutiny than ever on your data, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get around the challenges of everybody's a scientist now, right? and everybody has their own table and interpretation and everything. And because I think this is something, a new dynamic that we have to deal with, is everybody and access to information, which is completely fine, it's great. But the alternative and the fact that we have to deal with that as emergency managers and as from your own medical intelligence community is the fact that you now have greater scrutiny on the decisions that you're making because people interpret data in different ways.
Well, it's just like you said in the beginning of our conversation, before everybody hopped on, you can't please everybody, and you got to just push forward and do your best with your own training and experience to do the right thing. As far as access to information goes, I think there's a mortality rate associated with the type of society you live in. I mean, and that's a controversial thought, right? So we've always known that some authoritarian regimes might actually perform better in these kinds of crises for that very reason, is that they have the ability to shut down communication lines and so forth. And it'd be interesting, once COVID gets done, it'd be interesting to go back and assess how well did North Korea do? How well did, Turkmenistan do? How well did different countries do with different types of regimes, But as far as, the everyone's an expert phenomenon, I was given wise counsel from a colleague of mine who was formerly with the intelligence community. He just said, look, Jim, your job is to give people warning. It's not your job to tell them what to do necessarily with that warning. It's on them to decide how they're going to manage that. But then for all of us, that's pretty painful to sit back and watch people make really bad choices and die for those bad choices, right? But I mean, I don't think that's any different than what happens during hurricane evacuations, where you tell people evacuate and they choose not to, and then they die. Far less scale, of course, than what we've seen with COVID. As far as the open information goes, I mean, yeah, I don't really have good answers. And if you were to ask me what's the biggest part of this whole engagement that we really struggled with accurate assessments on, it's the influence of social media and the negative impact of social media combined with that mass media component that's been sensationalized. News media does not communicate the way it used to. And we need news media to communicate the way they used to, not the sensationalistic behavior that they love to engage in now, where everything is apocalyptic, Yeah,
absolutely. Harold, over to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, Jim. That was very enlightening and a very good overview. And you mentioned the word trust a lot of times. And I think that's a key issue and then I refer now to vaccination, because we see around the world a lot of vaccination hesitancy. Like in the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, there is a high trust between government and the public. And we expect to reach 95% vaccination rate. But we do see this is not the case all over the world. How can you beat that? And I think a lot of effort should be put into that. I know the social media is really making this difficult, but do you have any ideas?
Well, I take as a physician, right? So I deal with this as a physician as well every day with my families, right? and I'm a pediatrician, right? So the whole vaccination issue writ large is a big issue for me. I do think that any society that says, okay, if you choose, I mean, this is the controversy, right? Is how do you hold people accountable for those decisions and those behaviors, right? And right now, we don't have any system whatsoever of accountability. We have physicians who are allowed to say whatever they want to say without fear of losing their license. Now, there have been threats recently made by our licensing boards to cut that out, right? But we haven't really seen that enforced, okay? What I would say to someone who's anti-vaccination, I would say, okay, you have a right to make that choice for your family. I may not agree with what that means for the rest of our community because you're counting on all of us to provide that protection immunity for you and your family, right? We're all taking the risk, but you've chosen not to. So that's not a very civic-minded behavior, right? Are you going to pay for your hospital bill then if you're hospitalized? And that's where the conversation completely goes off the rails, right? Because there's this expectation that not only do I have the ability to choose not to vaccinate and participate in my civic duty, but I'm counting on everybody to also pay the $250,000 bill from the ICU if I get put on a ventilator and have to ride that vent for 6 weeks. Okay, and so that for us is a huge issue. But then on that side of the debate, people come in and say, well, what about smoking, right? Look at all the unbelievable amount of money we blew as a society caring for people who got cancer, right? And not holding that industry accountable for that, right? So these are the struggles, right? And so the only thing I can do as a physician and as a health security intelligence professional is to just build trust one person at a time and do the best I can to show people that I'm not trying to deceive anybody. I'm doing the best I can with all the uncertainties I have to deal with in my life. And I have a family too. And I'm here to support our allies, right? So we all through that timeline, we were communicating with NATO. We were communicating with our colleagues in Europe and sharing, we were all cross-sharing hypotheses, right? On social media, one of the interesting things that we do on social media is we're running an operation. Okay, so we will say, here's what we think, and we just put it out there. And we know darn well, because the way social media works, we'll get people come in and say, oh, you're full of it. We disagree with you, or you're the devil, or whatever the complaint is. Sometimes there's a thread in there that maybe we might have missed, or some other observation that proves to be very important and can actually help change our assessment for the better. So it's not all bad. It's just you got to learn how to sift through that noise and learn how to kind of work the crowd to get to what you really need. But I please don't misunderstand me. I don't feel like I have crisp, clear answers and solutions to that problem. And I do think all of this conversation we've been having here is predictive of how we're going to manage climate change or not, as the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a huge topic that's been coming up recently. I was in a meeting yesterday, and climate security is becoming, and has been for a while, to be fair, but has been growing in importance recently. So now, when you get into the fact of, okay, Florida, you need to move inland about 20 miles, that's not going to go well, right? So that's something that's going to be coming up as well. But I think there's a few questions I want to stay on topic here because we got some other questions that came up. When did the U.S. start genome sequencing to identify variants of concern and variants of interest? This is the first question. And second question being, how has the caseload trends behaved after the schools have reopened in the U.S.?
So the first part of that I heard, so I was just replying to Mark there real quick. First of all, the genomic sequencing, let me give you some context. When we were monitoring the emergence of H5N1 avian influenza, we had a lot of genomic sequencing experts in the mix, and we were constantly swung from one end of the risk spectrum to the other by these guys who kept coming in and interjecting at very top levels of government saying, oh, we just picked up on another sequence change in influenza virus. Now we're all going to die. And then we'd watch, and it didn't pan out that way systemically. And so we learned from that experience that it's always trust but verify. That's really interesting that you've discovered a new sequence. You think it's important. Okay, well, unfortunately, given that there's billions of dollars on the line here, I'm going to have to see a little bit more proof systemically, which is bad because then that puts our warning delta deeper into the crisis, right? And we did do that with the complaints around Brazil, right? So Brazil, it looked awful in Amazonia, as you recall, and everybody panicked and thought, oh my gosh, this is going to get even worse, right? But from the US perspective, when P1, that particular variant landed here, we barely even noticed it. And part of the reason is because we'd already been hit with other variants. And so there's some built up naturally acquired immunity, but also a little bit of the vaccine by then. But going back to genomic sequencing and when we were paying attention to it, it was really that August timeframe when that paper came out. Now we finally had proof. Now we were finally able to connect the dots that we had a substantial change in the sequence. The academics believe that this is what happened to the epidemiology of the virus as a result, and we had that proof point of Lombardia. Now, if you think that out, you'll realize, holy cow, Jim, you literally, that's not much forewarning then, right? You're basically telling us you got a 5-alarm fire, it's already burning half the city down. Well, unfortunately, yeah, at the moment, that's where we're at. But I think in the future, maybe we can start anticipating, now that we're learning a little bit more on the genetic side, that this particular sequence means that the epidemiology may change in this way, kind of thing, right? So, so as far as sequencing goes, the UK was first, as far as I'm concerned. They got out there with the most useful information first. They did a wonderful job, I think, of reporting their data. I love their dashboards. They included a lot of caveats. You'll see in there all their data. They'll show when did they increase testing in the community, for example, right? So that the increased case counts, the caveat here is we've increased testing, right? So that's really important to do that, right? Important principles in maintaining trust with your public is being transparent about how you're producing the data. And so then when they rolled in with the genomic sequence work, I think that was a point of leadership for the whole rest of the world, including the US. And the US sort of took suit after them. What we've noticed is everyone's been building this airplane after you were supposed to be in the air 3 hours ago, and you're flying through the air, but you're still trying to build the wings, right? And so that's been very disconcerting. And so it feels like we're constantly reacting, right, to the operational need, always after the fact, it seems, right? If you look at my graph on 1918, right, remember that graph where it showed that public health, their reporting of mortality in 1918 was time staggered. It was delayed from the media reporting of mortality. That's a classic pattern of response behavior when you're dealing with a health security crisis. This reactive sort of, I got to catch up to this kind of process. That's a classic pattern of a health security crisis. So I would hope that for the future might look a little bit brighter, because now we are understanding how the sequencing data really does fit into operations quite a bit better with this crisis. Best I've seen yet, right? And I've been through a bunch of these. And leading up to this, it was a circus. I'm not going to lie. It was really, Ebola in West Africa, we knew the sequences were changing, right? And that caused a lot of anxiety. That was one of the more scarier crises I've been involved in. But it was more so the uncertainty, because we didn't understand how to put the sequencing data into proper operational context. But now I think, now we've had a pretty good demonstration of it.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's critically important. And one of the things that you mentioned is this uncertainty. And I think this is where, from the emergency management community, there's this window, like you were talking about in the beginning of your presentation, right? So we're seeing these things, we're seeing these trends, we have these indicators, we're in this window, but the problem is we don't know what's outside the window.
Yeah.
So when does an emergency become a catastrophe? And I think that's something that's always sort of weighing on the minds of not only just emergency managers, but even, city officials, government officials, state, federal level, whatever the case is. And it's an extremely difficult position to be in, because as we analyze the data, as we're in midair building this plane, and we're saying, well, we weren't really at a catastrophic state, but we don't necessarily know that in the middle of this whole experience, right? And that the caveat there being, and one of the real critical points for us is the fact that when we are trying to manage the crisis, trying to manage the public communications, trying to manage these things, the pressure to declare, like what you've mentioned previously, is there's so much pressure to declare because nobody wants to bear the responsibility of being wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is really a difficult balance to be achieved.
It's horrible, right? I mean, and so if you really want a good case study, go back and look at West Africa and Ebola, where CDC got into Time magazine. They said, we're projecting 2.5 million fatalities by February, whatever it was, right? I think 2015 or 24, I don't know. But if you go back and look at that, there was huge controversy, right? Because then what was ultimately realized was about, just north of 20,000 fatalities, not 2.5 million. So they were off by 65-fold on their projection. And so then the public health guys were like, oh, well, see, it didn't turn out to be that way because we intervened, because we used the forecast to scare people into actually doing something about it. Well, okay, there is that argument, right? But we also lost trust, right? It was yet another nail in that coffin of trust, because a lot of people took note of that and realized the models are just wrong. There's a lot of wrong in the way that we're creating our models, right? And so if you go back in history, again, the disaster sociology community, I find more resonance with disaster sociology than I do with public health, honestly, in my work, because they talk about the very issues you brought up, Kyle, is that this is a repeating theme that's been going on since at least the 50s. And it really was brought home with a lot of the nuclear accident concerns, right? The reactor accidents, right? If you remember back in the 70s, we were obsessed with that, right? The China syndrome, And if you go back then, you'll see that folks brought up the exact same issues that we still grapple with today, and it's just a different crisis, right? But that's where I share a lot of, gosh, if I were to say that there's a community of brothers and sisters for me and people like me, it's really with the emergency managers and the disaster sociologists, because we all are suffering from the same types of problems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have now gone a little bit over our hour mark. So Jim, really appreciate the presentation. Very interesting. And we'll probably have to have you come back sometime. And we'll have another discussion after you got some more data and we've been through another wave or something, or maybe at this point we'll be from pandemic to endemic and then everything will be a different story. But no, thank you very much for the presentation. And of course, this is a reminder for everybody else. We do have a couple of questions, Jim, so I'll probably follow up via email with you on that. And of course, everybody else, thank you so much for your time for being here. Harold, do you have anything before we close the session?
No, I'm very much in agreement with your statements. It was very good.
All right, thanks a lot. So thanks, everybody. Thanks again. Make sure you go join the annual conference for teams. The registration link is in the chat. So thanks a lot, and we will see you in the annual conference. Jim, thanks again, and thanks for joining us. Have a good day, everybody.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.